The city was alive with its usual midnight chaos. Horns blaring, neon lights flickering, people stumbling out of bars, lost in their own worlds. Daniel Carter, a seasoned taxi driver, had seen it all. Drunks, liars, heartbreaks, deals made in whispers, and tears hidden behind tinted windows. But that night he picked up the wrong passenger, a CEO in a bad mood. The man flagged him down outside an upscale bar, his sharp navy blue suit slightly disheveled, his Rolex glinting under the streetlights. Daniel barely had time to put the car in park before the guy yanked open the door and threw himself into the back seat. "Drive," he ordered, not even bothering to look at him. "I don't have all night." Daniel raised an eyebrow in the rear-view mirror. Another entitled businessman. He had driven plenty of them before. Impatient, rude, drowning in arrogance. "Where to?" Daniel asked, keeping his voice steady. "Westwood Towers," the man snapped, pulling out his phone. "And step on it. I don't have time to waste with people like you." Daniel's fingers tightened around the steering wheel. He took a slow breath, forcing himself to remain calm. "Sure thing," he muttered, pulling into traffic. The disrespect begins. For the first few minutes, silence filled the cab. The CEO, who Daniel now recognized as Ethan Graves, the founder of one of the city's biggest investment firms, was too busy barking orders into his phone to acknowledge him. Then, just as they hit a red light, Ethan sighed dramatically. "You know," he said, tapping his fingers against the window, "this city used to be something." Daniel didn't respond. He had learned long ago that these types loved the sound of their own voices. "Now," Ethan scoffed, "it's drowning in people like you, leeching off the system, driving cabs, doing nothing while people like me actually keep this place running." Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "It's funny. You probably make what? A couple $100 a night? Meanwhile, I make that in seconds." Daniel took another deep breath, focusing on the road. He had dealt with plenty of jerks before, but there was something about this guy. His smugness, his absolute certainty that he was untouchable, that made him want to speak up. Instead, he said nothing, because Daniel knew something Ethan didn't. And tomorrow, Ethan Graves was in for the biggest shock of his life. Daniel pulled up to Westwood Towers, a towering glass and steel structure that screamed wealth and power. It was the kind of place where men like Ethan Graves ruled the world from their penthouse offices, making decisions that determined the fate of thousands, often without a second thought. The moment the cab stopped, Ethan barely glanced up from his phone. "How much?" he asked, already distracted. $24.50, Daniel replied, his voice steady. Ethan scoffed. "For a 10-minute ride? Ridiculous." He dug into his pocket, pulled out a $100 bill and tossed it over the seat like it was garbage. "Keep the change," he muttered, pushing the door open. Daniel picked up the bill, staring at it for a second. It wasn't generosity. It was an insult. Ethan wasn't tipping him. He was buying the right to be a jerk. But Daniel simply folded the bill neatly and tucked it away. He didn't react. Didn't need to. Because tonight, Ethan was on top of the world. Tomorrow that world would come crashing down. The fall of a giant. The next morning, Ethan Graves walked into his firm's executive boardroom with his usual air of confidence. His company, Graves Capital, had been a dominant force for over a decade. A kingmaker in the finance world, it had crushed competition, controlled markets, and dictated the future of entire industries. But today something wasn't right. His CFO, Charles, stood stiffly near the window, his jaw tight. The entire boardroom was eerily quiet. Even his assistant wouldn't meet his gaze. Ethan frowned, setting his coffee down. "What's with the long faces?" he asked, forcing a chuckle. "You all look like someone died." No one laughed. Charles cleared his throat. "Sir," he began, hesitating, "we have a problem." Ethan rolled his eyes. "Of course we do. We're in finance. That's literally the job." He sank into his leather chair, stretching out. "All right, hit me." Charles slid a file across the table. Ethan flipped it open, then froze. His stomach dropped. It was an emergency notice from the bank. A $1.2 billion investment deal, one that Graves Capital had been counting on, had been officially withdrawn. Ethan's breath hitched. No, this wasn't possible. This investment was locked in. It was supposed to be guaranteed. If it didn't go through, his company would be on the verge of collapse. His mind raced. He needed to fix this. Immediately. "Get me a meeting with the investors," he snapped. "Now." Charles hesitated. "Sir, they've already scheduled a meeting. Today at noon." Ethan exhaled in relief. "Good. I'll handle this myself." But what Charles said next made his blood run cold. "Sir," he swallowed. "The investor we're meeting with is..." He hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said the name. Daniel Carter. Ethan's world came crashing down. The investor he never saw coming. Daniel Carter. The name echoed in Ethan's mind like a death sentence, because he knew that name. Last night, the taxi driver. Ethan's mouth went dry. This had to be a mistake, a misunderstanding. Daniel Carter was a cab driver, a nobody. He couldn't be the same person. But deep down, Ethan already knew. It was him. And suddenly, the way he had treated him last night didn't seem so insignificant anymore. Ethan Graves sat in the boardroom, his mind reeling. The walls around him felt tighter, the air heavier. Daniel Carter. The name echoed in his skull like a cruel joke. His instincts screamed that this was impossible. The man he had mocked and belittled last night, a mere taxi driver, was now sitting across from him, wearing a tailored suit, holding the fate of Graves Capital in his hands. It had to be a mistake. Maybe it was a coincidence. Maybe Daniel Carter was just another businessman with the same name. But deep down, Ethan knew the truth. It was him, his taxi driver. And by the way Daniel was looking at him, there was no doubt that he remembered every word Ethan had said the night before. A meeting like no other. Silence hung over the room. Ethan could feel his board members shifting uncomfortably, sensing the tension, but having no idea why. Finally, Charles, his CFO, cleared his throat. "Mr. Carter, thank you for taking the time to meet with us. As you know, Graves Capital is at a pivotal moment. We believe this partnership will be mutually beneficial." Daniel raised a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. His eyes never left Ethan's. "I appreciate the introduction," Daniel said smoothly. "But let's cut to the chase." His tone was calm, but there was an unmistakable edge underneath. "I've been reviewing the numbers," he continued, flipping through a file on the table. "Your firm is, well, let's just say it's in a precarious position." Ethan swallowed hard. Daniel turned a page. "If this investment doesn't go through, your liquidity collapses within the next 6 months." He glanced up. "Am I wrong?" Ethan forced himself to sit up straighter. He couldn't let this man see his panic. "No," he admitted carefully. "You're not wrong. But that's exactly why we're here. To form a strategic partnership." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "A partnership?" Ethan nodded. "That's right." Daniel let out a soft chuckle, closing the file. Something about the sound made Ethan's stomach tighten. He could feel it. This wasn't a negotiation. This was a reckoning. The power shift. Daniel leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "You know, Ethan," he said, tapping a finger on the table, Life has a funny way of teaching lessons. Ethan's chest tightened. Daniel continued, his voice casual. Last night I had a rather interesting conversation with a man who told me exactly what he thinks of people like me. Ethan felt the blood drain from his face. Would you like me to remind you of what he said? Daniel asked, raising an eyebrow. The silence was suffocating. Ethan's executives were watching now, their eyes darting between him and Daniel, clearly sensing that something was very, very wrong. Ethan licked his lips, forcing a tight smile. Daniel, I think we should focus on... No. Daniel interrupted smoothly. I insist. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and then, in a perfect imitation of Ethan's own voice, he said, People like you are the reason this city's falling apart. The words cut through the air like a knife. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. Daniel didn't stop. You probably make a couple $100 a night. I make that in seconds. Ethan gritted his teeth. You're nothing. The room felt ice cold. A few executives shifted uncomfortably. Charles stole a nervous glance at Ethan. Ethan forced himself to breathe. His entire world was unraveling. This man, this taxi driver, he had come here not to invest, but to humiliate him. Ethan had to do something, had to regain control. Daniel, he said, his voice strained but steady. I was out of line last night. If I offended you, Daniel held up a hand. No need for an apology, he said, his expression unreadable. I'm not here for revenge. Ethan's chest loosened slightly. Maybe there was still a way to salvage this. Then Daniel smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the kind of smile that made Ethan deeply, deeply uneasy. I'm just here to make sure, Daniel said, his tone light, that you never make the same mistake again. A taste of consequences. Ethan knew what was coming before Daniel even said it. The investment was gone. His company, his legacy, was about to crumble. But he wasn't going down without a fight. He straightened his shoulders. Daniel, he said carefully, I understand if you no longer want to invest. But if you walk away from this deal, you won't just be hurting me. You'll be hurting thousands of employees. Daniel's expression darkened. You think I don't know that, he said quietly. Ethan fell silent. Daniel exhaled. I've seen what happens when men like you treat people like they're disposable. His voice hardened. And I don't believe in rewarding arrogance. Ethan's jaw clenched. This was it. The final blow. Daniel pushed back his chair and stood. I've made my decision. Ethan already knew the answer, but still he had to ask. And? Daniel's gaze bored into him. The deal is off. The words landed like a hammer. Ethan's vision blurred. This couldn't be happening. Without this investment, Graves Capital would collapse, and there wasn't a damn thing he could do to stop it. Daniel straightened his cuffs. I'll see myself out. And just like that, he was gone, leaving behind a room full of stunned executives and a man who had just lost everything. Ethan sat frozen in his chair, staring at the door Daniel Carter had just walked out of. The walls of Graves Capital, the empire he had spent years building, suddenly felt too small, too suffocating. The silence in the boardroom was unbearable. Charles cleared his throat, shifting uncomfortably. Sir, what just happened? Ethan didn't answer. He knew exactly what had happened. Daniel Carter had just dismantled him. Not with money, not with corporate takeovers or legal maneuvers, with one decision. One simple, calculated decision that had sealed Ethan's fate. His company was already struggling. Investors were watching closely. The second the news got out that Graves Capital had failed to secure a critical deal, the stock would plummet. And when that happened, the sharks would circle. His rivals, The competitors he had crushed on his way to the top. They'd tear him apart. Everything he had worked for was unraveling. And worst of all, it was his own fault. A desperate move. Ethan had always prided himself on being a man of power, control, and strategy. Even now, when the walls were closing in, his mind raced to find a way out. There was always a way out. He couldn't afford to lose. Not like this. Not because of some damn taxi driver. His hands curled into fists as he turned to Charles. "Find Carter," he snapped. "Get him back in here. Tell him we'll—" "Sir," Charles interrupted carefully. "I don't think he's coming back." Ethan's jaw tightened. "Then get me his number." Charles hesitated, then sighed. He didn't leave any contact information. Of course he didn't. Ethan knew what this was. Daniel wanted him to sweat. He wanted him to feel the consequences of his arrogance. But Ethan wasn't done yet. If Carter wouldn't come back to him, he'd go to Carter. Hunting down the ghost. That night, for the first time in years, Ethan didn't go home. There was no penthouse suite waiting for him. No victory drink to celebrate another deal secured. Instead, he sat in the back of his town car, scrolling through everything he could find on Daniel Carter. The man was a ghost. No interviews, no flashy social media presence, no billionaire playboy lifestyle, just a trail of businesses, investments, and philanthropic efforts that led to one undeniable fact. Daniel Carter was smarter than Ethan had ever given him credit for. He had built an empire in silence. And now, he had used it to destroy Ethan's. Ethan clenched his jaw. He needed to see him. Not in a boardroom, not in some high-rise office. Face to face, man to man. And he had a feeling he knew exactly where to find him. The taxi driver returns. Ethan stepped out onto the wet pavement of the same street he had been on the night before. The place where he had hailed a cab, full of arrogance and self-importance. Where he had sat in the back seat and mocked the man who now held his fate in his hands. The irony wasn't lost on him. The city was alive, neon lights reflecting off the slick streets, the sounds of distant sirens and honking horns filling the air. And then, there he was, Daniel Carter, standing casually beside a yellow taxi, speaking with an elderly driver. For a moment, Ethan hesitated. He had spent years commanding every room he walked into. But now, he was just another man standing in the rain, hoping for a second chance. Ethan took a breath, straightened his jacket, and walked toward him. Ethan Graves had never hesitated before. Every step he had taken in life had been deliberate, calculated, confident. But tonight, as he walked toward Daniel Carter, standing beside that yellow cab, he felt something foreign creeping into his chest. Doubt. Would Carter even listen to him? Would he give him a chance to explain? Or had Ethan's fate already been decided? Daniel turned just as Ethan stepped closer. His expression was unreadable. Calm, composed, like he had been expecting this. Ethan swallowed his pride and spoke first. "We need to talk." Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Do we?" Ethan forced himself to hold his gaze. "You made your point in the boardroom. I get it. But this isn't just about me. There are thousands of employees at Graves Capital." Daniel exhaled slowly, shoving his hands into his pockets. "And now you care?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. Ethan bristled. "I've always cared." Daniel let out a short laugh. "Number. You've cared about one thing. Yourself." Ethan clenched his jaw, forcing down his frustration. He couldn't lose control. Not now. "Look," he said, trying a different approach. "I was an ass last night. I won't deny that. But what happened in that taxi doesn't define me." Daniel studied him, his face giving nothing away. Then, he spoke. "That's where you're wrong. Ethan stiffened. "Excuse me?" Daniel took a slow step forward, his voice steady. "That ride? That moment?" He shook his head. "It tells me everything I need to know about you." Ethan felt a flicker of panic. "Daniel." "No!" Daniel cut him off, his voice sharper now. "For years you've treated people like they were beneath you. You walked into that taxi, assumed I was no one, and felt entitled to tear me down." Ethan looked away, his jaw tight. Daniel wasn't wrong, but he also wasn't completely right. "I built everything I have, from the ground up," Ethan said, his voice quieter now. "I had nothing when I started. I fought for every deal, every inch of success." Daniel's gaze hardened. "And somewhere along the way, you forgot what it's like to be on the other side." Ethan swallowed. Because that was the truth he didn't want to face. The weight of consequences. The rain picked up, light droplets turning into a steady downpour. People hurried past them, umbrellas snapping open, taxis pulling in and out of the street. But Ethan and Daniel stood still. Ethan took a slow breath. "You have every reason to walk away," he admitted. "To let Graves' capital fall." Daniel didn't respond. Ethan's throat felt tight. This was his last chance. "But if you do," he continued, "you're not proving anything to me." He met Daniel's gaze. "You're proving that you're no different than I was last night." A long silence stretched between them. Then, Daniel chuckled, shaking his head. "That's bold." Ethan exhaled, pushing his luck. "You didn't make it this far by holding grudges. You made it by seeing the bigger picture." Daniel tapped his fingers against his jacket, considering. Finally, he spoke. "I won't save your company," he said. Ethan's heart plummeted. "But..." Ethan's head snapped up. Daniel held his gaze. "There might be a way forward," he said. "But not on your terms." Ethan hesitated. "What does that mean?" Daniel took a step closer. "It means you'll have to trust me." Ethan Graves had spent his entire life being the one in control. The idea of trusting someone else, letting go of power, stepping back, it was foreign, unnatural. And yet, here he was, standing in the rain, staring at the man who had dismantled him in a single day. Daniel Carter. And Daniel was offering him something unexpected, a way forward, but not on Ethan's terms. The offer. Ethan inhaled sharply. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Daniel crossed his arms. "You step down." Ethan's stomach clenched. "That's not..." Daniel cut him off. "If you really care about your employees, if you really want to save what's left of your company, you'll step down. Publicly." Ethan felt a flash of anger. "I built that company from nothing," he snapped. "You can't expect me to just... I expect you to do what's right." The words hit like a hammer. Ethan's fists clenched. "And who takes over?" Daniel shrugged. "That's for the board to decide." Ethan hated this. Every instinct screamed at him to fight, to claw back control. But deep down, he knew the truth. Daniel wasn't here to humiliate him. He was here to give him a choice. Ethan could go down fighting and disgraced, or he could go down with dignity. The silence stretched between them. Ethan closed his eyes. Then, finally, he exhaled. Fine. The fall of a titan. 2 days later, the headlines were everywhere. Ethan Graves resigns as CEO of Graves Capital. Graves Capital saved. New leadership to take over the end of an era. A billionaire's downfall. Ethan watched from his penthouse as the world moved on without him. No more phone calls. No more emergency meetings. No more power. It was strange. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't running anything. But maybe that was the point. Maybe he had needed this. Because in the end, his own arrogance had destroyed him. And Daniel Carter? He had just given him the chance to start over. Epilogue. A different kind of ride. 1 month later, Ethan walked through the city, hands in his pockets. He had spent weeks reflecting on everything that had happened, and for the first time in a long time, he felt lighter. He stepped to the curb, raised his hand. A yellow taxi pulled up. The driver rolled down the window. "Where to?" Ethan hesitated. Then, with a small smile, he said, "Surprise me." And as the cab pulled away, he finally understood. Power fades, money disappears, but the way you treat people, that stays forever. Final question: what would you have done? If you were Ethan, would you have stepped down? Or would you have fought until the end? Let me know in the comments. Was his downfall justified? And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Because in life, you never know who you're really talking to.